The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A., and I am very pleased to have as my guest today, Omer Bartov. Omer Bartov was born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and St. Antony's College, Oxford. His early research concerned the Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes it committed in World War II, analyzed in his books, The Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, and Hitler's Army. He then turned to the links between total war and genocide, discussed in his books Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, and Germany's War and the Holocaust. Omer Bartov's interest in representation also led to his study, The Jew in Cinema, which examines the recycling of antisemitic stereotypes in film. His more recent work has focused on interethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. His book, Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine, investigates the politics of memory in West Ukraine, while Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, is a microhistory of ethnic coexistence and violence. The book received the National Jewish Book Award and the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research, among others, and has been translated into several languages. Bartov's Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past, explores the centuries predating the Holocaust. He has edited several volumes, including Israel-Palestine, Lands and Peoples. His novel, The Butterfly and the Axe, was published in January 2023. His new book, Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis, has just come out. Omer Bartov is the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, where he has taught since 2000. Omer Bartov, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. You were born in Israel and grew up there, attending Tel Aviv University before studying at Oxford. How did your family come there, and what was Israel like when you were a young man?
My father was actually born in Palestine in 1926 in Petah Tikva, which now is really a suburb of Tel Aviv, but then was really far from it. His parents came from Poland just a year before he was born. And my mother was born in the town that I wrote about, in Buczacz, which was then in Poland. Now it's in Ukraine. And she came to Palestine in 1935 when she was 11 with her two brothers and her parents, and the rest of the family that stayed behind were all murdered during the Holocaust. By the time I was born, in the mid-1950s, much of what had been there just 10 years ago, or even less than that, was gone. So in a sense, I think about people of my generation as having been born after everything had just happened. The war, the Holocaust, the War of 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the expulsion of the Palestinians. And there were remnants of all of that around us, but there wasn't much talk about it, not about the Holocaust, although we were surrounded by people who still had numbers on their forearms and traumatic memories, and not about the expulsion of the Palestinians, although we were surrounded by villages that had been emptied of their populations.
Wow. So were there events that happened while you were living in Israel that changed your beliefs over time about the state of Israel?
Yes, I mean, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, the sort of view of how you educate our generation was to look forward. The future belonged to us, so to speak. We were the first native-born Israelis, right? And there was a kind of sense of shame about the Holocaust. There was, as I said, a kind of erasure of memory of what had been in Palestine before. But it was an optimistic view of we are building a new country. It was a poor country and a very provincial country. Over time, with the war of 67, when the country greatly expanded its territory and became much more self-assured, and the war of 73, which was a big shake-up to Israeli confidence, things changed a great deal. I'd say that probably the most important change was that Israel became an occupying country. In 67, Israel conquered vast territories, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula. And in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were many of the Palestinians who had been expelled from Israel in 1948. And so the goal of Zionism to create a Jewish majority state was defeated by Israel's own victory in 67 because it took back all these people who had been expelled. But they did not become citizens. They remained occupied populations. And initially the idea was that these were to be bargaining chips for peace, that Israel would trade territory for peace. But Israel got used to those territories and thought maybe we can keep them. But keeping the territories meant keeping their populations. So I think that in the long run, we are talking about 57 years of occupation. That changed the mentality of the country. It corrupted it in many ways. It became a country which by now has 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians, and the Jews are the bosses, and the Palestinians are those who are being bossed around.
That's really interesting to hear that switch, that obviously if you occupy the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, these were very populated areas with refugee camps of people who'd been removed from what was pre-67 Israel. And I never thought of it that way, that all of a sudden you have all these other people within the supposed boundary, or certainly the boundaries of control for the state of Israel, who are not there because they're Jews seeking a new homeland. They are there because they've always been in that region, or their ancestors have been there. So, an interesting way of thinking about that. And I hadn't thought of that. You also mentioned, as much as there was, no mention of displacement of Palestinians, you also said there was shame around the Holocaust. And I wondered if you could go into that a little bit, because I'm not clear about, I mean, I could understand feelings of grief and loss and bitterness, but what's the shame that you're speaking of there?
So this is the other important side of, if you try to sort of think about the two faces of Israel. One, as we said, is the relationship with the Palestinians and then the occupation that has had a huge effect on Israeli society. The other is the Holocaust. So, when Israel is established, there are about 600,000 Jews in it. And within 10 years, the population doubles. And it grows very quickly. And many of the people are people who've come as survivors. Many others come from North Africa and the Middle East. The Zionist mythology was that Zionism would transform the Jews, would create a new Jew, would normalize Jewish existence. And part of that normalization of Jewish existence was the Jews would fight for their own survival, They would have their own army, they would have their own police, they would be strong and muscular and have hairy legs and be really muscular people. And the Holocaust, when I was growing up, apart from those who rebelled, like the rebels of the Warsaw Ghetto were seen as great heroes, was seen and talked about as a case in which Jews went like sheep to the slaughter. They did not resist. They did not fight. If you go back and listen to the Eichmann trial, you'll hear the main prosecutor, Hausner, asking the witnesses, why did you not rise up? Why did you not fight? And when they tried to say we were surrounded by SS men with machine guns and we were there with our families, somehow it was not translated into any understanding of the fate of Jews in the Holocaust. So there was shame in the sense that that was the old skin that Zionism managed to shed and become a proud, new, fighting, and often they said cruel nation. We have to be strong and cruel. Now, that changed. By the 1980s, the Holocaust is no longer an event that one should be ashamed of. It's an event around which Israeli national identity is constituted. And that has its own price, because what it does, it creates a sense that we should never let the Holocaust happen again. And anybody who threatens us in any way may be plotting another Holocaust against us, and therefore they have to be destroyed. They have to be struck as powerfully and decisively as possible so as to prevent another Holocaust. And this evolves after the Eichmann trial, much more after the War of 73, then with the rise of the right wing. Menachem Begin, the head of the Likud party, becomes prime minister in 1977. And from then on, there is a new view of the Holocaust, which makes us always potential victims, and therefore creates a kind of built-in, I'd say, aggression toward anyone who may threaten the state in any way.
In that context, there's been, I would call it further rightward movement in the government in Israel over the last several years. And last August, which was before the Hamas attacks and before the war in Gaza, you co-signed, along with more than 1,500 other academics, an open letter calling on U.S. Jewish groups to speak out against the policies of Netanyahu's government, the 37th government, saying, you said it had brought a very radical shift. And so obviously things have been changing over time, but this was, I gather, something even more significant. What's changed in Israel more recently, and what especially is different with the current Netanyahu regime?
So what happened was that in November 2022, in the last of a whole cycle of elections in Israel, very, very frequent elections in which Netanyahu was kind of trying to hold on to power and never quite winning them, he finally managed to cobble together a coalition. But that coalition was very different from everything else, from every previous coalition government that he had. And as you know, Israel is a parliamentary system, so you always need to have a coalition of different parties. No party is strong enough to have power on its own. And the reason that he had to do that was that the center parties and center-left parties no longer trusted him because he had betrayed them several times in previous coalitions. So he formed a coalition made up of two main elements. One is extreme right-wing, messianic, Jewish supremacist, settler, very extreme. And the other is made of the Orthodox, who don't really care much about politics at all. What they care about is the government giving them money to maintain their religious schools, the yeshivot, and allowing the young men, whose numbers has grown tremendously since the establishment of the state, and not to serve in the military and to just study and be supported by the government, to be subsidized by the Israeli taxpayer. This was a coalition that he formed. Now, having formed it, because he now depended entirely on this coalition to stay in power, and because he had been indicted for severe corruption himself and was afraid that if his coalition falls, he might end up in jail, he bent over backward to please his coalition partners. And he initially bent toward these extreme right elements. And one thing that they wanted was to reform the Israeli judicial system, what they called a judicial overhaul. In fact, it was an attempted judicial coup. The idea was to weaken the Supreme Court, which was the only real bulwark for democracy in Israel, to such an extent that it would no longer stand in the way of the executive. And in Israel, when you have a government, the government has to have a majority in parliament. So if the executive has unlimited powers, the parliament is not going to control it because the parliament is in the pocket of the government. So it's only the judiciary that can somehow balance that. And that was an attempt to undermine it so as ultimately, as we said in our petition, to perpetuate the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, eventually to annex it and to get rid of as many Palestinians living there as possible, because Israel wanted the land but had a problem with the people living in it. Now, there was a massive protest movement against that. But the protest movement did not want to talk about what we called in our August 4th petition, the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room was the occupation. And the protesters mostly wanted to talk about their own privileges as Jews living under a democracy afforded, and that their privileges would be taken away from them. And we said, look, this is not only about your privileges, it's about actually perpetuating the occupation and thereby the corruption of the entire country. Now, all of this exploded in our faces on October 7th, when it turned out that the Palestinian issue could no longer be swept under the rug, as Netanyahu had tried to do for 2 decades, but was alive and present and deadly.
Yeah, very. I want to welcome any listeners who have just tuned in to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD. My guest is Omer Bartov. He is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. So in talking about the elephant in the room, as it were, the occupation and the consequences of it, it has struck me over time, as an American Jew myself, that if the policies of Israel were to make Israel safe, were working, then it would be safe by now. And it clearly has not been working. And I want to come back to some other questions, but what, in your view, would be necessary for Israel to actually be safe and be in peaceful coexistence with its neighbors?
So look, first, let me say that yes, the goal of Zionism was to create a space that would be safe for Jews, a safe haven for Jews. This was the main rationale for Zionism and for creating a Jewish state where the Jews would rule over themselves, right? And it was in large part a response to nationalism and anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 19th century and early parts of the 20th century. Unfortunately, what has happened is that the least safe place for Jews in the world today is Israel, and that Israel is actually playing a significant role today in the rise of anti-Semitism. Now, this is a huge irony. I'm not saying that anti-Semitism would disappear if Israel did not exist. It existed before Israel, it would exist after Israel. But Israel right now, its own policies certainly contributing to its rise. So how can Israel be a safer place? Israel has to make up its mind what kind of country it wants to be. As I said before, between the Jordan and the sea live today 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews. They are not going anywhere. They are staying there. But they have to find a way to live side by side. You cannot solve this problem by violence. Both sides have done their best to solve it by violence, to gain what they want, which is all of it. And they cannot. So they have to find a way of sharing it. Israel is by far the more powerful player between in this conflict between Jews and Palestinians. And it has, up to now, only agreed to any kind of compromise under duress. It agreed to compromise after the very sort of half victory of 1973. It was only then that it agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. It was under massive pressure thereafter that Israel went into the Oslo Accords that then collapsed with the Second Intifada. And so what Israel has to do is to accept the fact that there are limits on its power, and those limits were now shown, and to find a way to cobble together with the United States, which is a major player here, and European powers, Arab states, which are quite willing to do that now, and a new Palestinian leadership to create a way for these two groups to live together. Now, we can talk about how that would look like, but there has to be a willingness. Unfortunately, right now, you have on both sides very extreme groups that are really mirror images of each other. You have Hamas on the one hand that wants to create a fundamentalist Islamic Palestinian state from the Jordan to the sea, and you have the national religious settlers who want to create a halachic state, a Jewish theocratic state, from the river to the sea without any Palestinians in it. Those extremists have to be marginalized. They don't represent the majority, but they have managed to control these populations. And there has to be a complete change in the political paradigm so as to stop these increasingly deadly cycles of violence.
Yeah, and you mentioned it in both cases of Hamas and the the extreme Jewish supremacy groups within Israel, that they don't represent a majority. And there are a lot of organizations within Israel that are working for different kinds of approaches that are, you could characterize them as peace groups, but there are so many that I don't want to paint them with too broad a brush. And it seemed, prior to October 7th, that the Netanyahu government might be on the verge of having to call a new election, because there were daily protests against the government and there was a lot of resistance, and even soldiers saying they were going to refuse service and all kinds of things going on before that, which, of course, we've seen the same phenomenon in the United States. When we start a war, all of a sudden everybody who's questioning whether they want to be part of what's going on are back on board. And I think that Netanyahu's government has played that card well in this case. But in terms of getting something that does represent the majority, there have been no elections, for example, in Gaza for a long time. Things were starting to look like Netanyahu might not make it the next time he faces election. What do you see as the potential for change at this point?
So yes, Netanyahu is, in fact, right now, there's a kind of irony here, because Netanyahu is considered now by a vast majority of the population, according to all the polls that I've seen, to be one of the worst prime ministers that Israel ever had. He's extremely unpopular. But the war in Gaza which he is conducting or misconducting, if you like, is still supported by the majority of Israeli citizens, at least Jewish Israeli citizens. There are 20% of citizens in Israel are Palestinian, but usually they're not counted. The same, I would say, a recent poll, very recent poll, has shown that there is real support among Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank for the Hamas attack, that they're very proud of the Hamas attack, and they don't believe that there were massacres. They're in denial of the massacres that obviously occurred. What exactly happened, there's some dispute over it, but there were clearly massacres. However, they don't support Hamas. If there were, in fact, an election today in the West Bank and in Gaza, only 30% would support Hamas, which is more or less the same, even less. I mean, Netanyahu will get even less than that. And so what is needed? What is needed is to remove, first of all, these two highly discredited, completely failed leaderships. Hamas, on the one hand, and Netanyahu, who is not only extreme right-wing, one has to understand he's become entirely incompetent and corrupt. It's not only that Israel underwent a fiasco on October 7th with the military being totally unprepared for what happened, it's also that the military campaign conducted in Gaza has been very badly conducted. You have now also about 150,000 Israeli citizens who have been displaced, and the government hardly pays any attention to them, not only along the Gaza border, but also in the north because of missile attacks from Hezbollah. And the government is just not managing the war. And so what has to be done is a change in the leadership. Now, how does that come about? Right now, there is no internal mechanism for that. I mean, we know how it could happen, but just like the Republicans in this country, all you need is 4 members of the Knesset with a bit of backbone to join a non-confidence vote in Netanyahu and his government will fall. But you can't find those people. They never show up. So what you need is external pressure. And that external pressure is insufficient. And the most important would come from the U.S. The United States can stop Israeli military action in a day because Israel is totally dependent now on vast transfer of munitions on a daily basis to Israel, to the IDF. Unfortunately, I just saw a couple of hours ago that the United States is sending more right now, more airplanes and more bombs, more dumb bombs, exactly the kind of bombs that killed so many people in Gaza, over 32,000 people, most of them civilians, half of the civilians children. The U.S. can stop it. If the U.S. can stop the war, and Netanyahu knows it, once there's a ceasefire, he may lose power. He wants the war to continue. And Hamas, of course, also is interested in the war continuing because if it ends, they may die. So this is the point at which, if there is no massive pressure on Israel, which would be also, of course, on the Palestinians, then things will only get worse by the day.
Yeah, it's horrendous. I mean, I've been following as much as I can news of what's going on the ground in Gaza, and you know, it's unimaginable to us here, living in our very nice war-free zone of the United States. But to see the level of destruction, and on top of that, you know, the lack of sanitation, the lack of water, and the starvation, I won't go there at this moment, but it to me is intolerable. And every day I find myself almost pounding my head against the wall, trying to figure out what can be done. Although I do wonder sometimes why we don't have people refusing to load the ships or blocking the ships or something here. And of course, I honestly don't know where the shipping takes place. The Anti-Defamation League has been keeping an inventory of anti-Semitic activities for many years. But I noticed recently that they have been including any demonstrations that call for a ceasefire in Gaza under the category of an anti-Semitic gathering. What's your reaction to that?
Well, look, I think two things are happening at the same time. There is a rise in anti-Semitism, and that rise in anti-Semitism started before the war in Gaza. We saw all kinds of manifestations. We can remember Charlottesville and so forth. And it's happening not only in the United States, it's happening also in Europe. It has to do with the rise of new populism, of xenophobia, of racism. And most of it is coming from the right, so coming from the left. And not only in the US, but also in Germany, the rise of right-wing, quasi-fascist parties popping up everywhere. In Germany, there's now a growing extreme right-wing party. That may become a coalition partner soon. So wow. That's one direction, right? And you can say it's because people have short memories and they forgot what things used to be like in World War II and what destruction these kind of movements wrought on the entire continent. On the other hand, there is growing, and I would say, generally speaking, commendable protest against what Israel is doing and the fact that the United States is facilitating it. The United States has become complicit in what Israel is carrying out in Gaza. One cannot deny it. This is the fact. Now, those who support Israel blindly, or those who are on the right wing, then come up and say, well, there is now growing anti-Semitism from the left. Now, there always was some, area where the extremes meet, as the French say. But by and large, as you say, rightly, I think, much of what accounts for so-called anti-Semitism, and that's very much part of what Netanyahu's governments have been pushing now for a couple of decades, is really redefining criticism of Israeli policies as anti-Semitic. And this kind of accounting for demonstrations in favor of Palestine, carrying a Palestinian flag, wearing a keffiyeh, opposing vehemently Israeli policies, counting that as anti-Semitism, first is false, simply false. Secondly, I would say if the interests of Israel are important to you, you should know that Netanyahu and the goons around him are the worst Zionists you could imagine. They are actually undermining the state of Israel. They are actually weakening it by the day with their insane, undemocratic, authoritarian, and brutal policies. Israel, if it continues on this path, on its own, without any anti-Semitism, will become a pariah state, will end up being poor, violent, and isolated from the rest of the world, and we start looking like South Africa at the time of the apartheid regime. And it could persist like that for several decades, becoming just a marginal, miserable little place until it implodes. And so resisting those policies is not only to stop the horrors that are happening in Gaza, it should also be understood as saving Israel from itself, from this kind of homicidal, authoritarian leadership that it currently has.
Thank you for that very clear summary. We have to take a very short break. We'll be right back with more conversation with Omer Bartov right after this. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Omer Bartov. He is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, where he has taught since 2000. And he was born in Israel and has done an enormous amount of research on what I'm going to dub the social phenomena of genocide. I want to come to you wrote a couple books about Galicia and in particular the village of Buczacz where your mother was born. And you wrote an article a couple of years ago about visiting that region in Ukraine. And in it you wrote, "How does a community of interethnic coexistence of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews transform into community of genocide, where neighbors turn against neighbors? Within the context, to be sure, of foreign occupation and regimes bent on oppression and extermination, the gap between memory, nostalgia, and sheer physical beauty on the one hand, and the extraordinary inhumanity, brutality, and callousness of human beings on the other was unbridgeable. The war, the genocide of the Jews, the ethnic cleansing of the Poles, and the imposition of an oppressive and vengeful Soviet regime seemed to have put an end to the world of Borderlands that lasted for centuries. And despite its many warps, prejudices, vast inequality, grinding poverty, and occasional bursts of horrific violence, was also the birthplace of much beauty and creativity, precisely because of its mix of cultures, religions, and ethnicities." So I read that and I thought it was beautiful, and thank you for that. You're considered one of the world's experts on the subject of genocide, and you've documented the events that happened in that region of Galicia, which is, for those not familiar with it, it's a region that's borders have crossed a few times, but includes what is present-day southeastern Poland and part of western Ukraine that once had a very large and thriving Jewish population. So the word genocide is heard a lot more in recent years. And as it often is in the US, we get a little fast and loose with labeling things. So I wanted to ask you what lessons we should keep in mind as we go forward, looking not just at events, say, in Gaza or anywhere else in the world, but as we look at events here in our own country. What lessons should we keep in mind when we talk about genocide?
Yeah, I think the two aspects of this that we can talk about. One is the term genocide and how we use terminology. And I think we tend to be very loose and imprecise in our use of terminology. And that can be because we feel emotional about something. We feel, you see many people dying, many people being murdered. And you say, well, we have a word for that. The word is genocide. So why are we not calling it genocide? But because we do that, we may actually obfuscate and confuse people as to what is happening. Because genocide is not the killing of large numbers of people. That can be a crime against humanity. That could be mass murder. That can be war crimes. Genocide is a very specific crime. It's a crime that is perpetrated with an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, and that group could be an ethnic group, a national group, a religious group. And so what you need to identify that something is genocide is not simply that you see many people being killed, but that there is a clear intention to kill them. It's not some side effect of another event, and that you're killing them not as individuals, but as members of a particular group. And it's important to keep that in mind, because if we don't keep that in mind, we tend to think that if we're watching war crimes, and war crimes can be horrific on a vast scale, that's not good enough. We have to call it genocide. And because genocide is much harder to prove than war crimes, then we end up debating whether some horror that is happening in the world is genocide or not, rather than saying these are severe breaches of humanitarian laws, of international humanitarian law, and therefore they have to be stopped, whether they're genocide or not. It doesn't matter right now. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing that you refer to is how, to my mind at least, how what I studied in Eastern Europe, this kind of collapse of an interethnic community into a community of genocide, how is that relevant to what we are watching now in Israel-Palestine and to the societies we live in, fortunately, say, in the United States? And I think it is relevant. Because we tend to think of those other places as places, these are places from hell. These are not very different from ours, so we have nothing to learn from them. But in fact, what you learn is that it is possible that people of different creeds, different ethnicities, different languages will live side by side well for a long time. And a certain process will then begin. Often it has to do with nationalism or xenophobia that will start setting them one against the other. That is that the same groups that had learned how to live together and had done so creatively will turn one against the other. And when that happens, it tends to be particularly gruesome, because it's exactly the proximity, the familiarity of one group with another that seems to necessitate this kind of gratuitous violence that is genocide on the local level. And if you think about it in terms of Israel-Palestine, you have Jews and Palestinians living side by side and have lived side by side for a long time, since before World War I. There were Jews living in late Ottoman Palestine together with Arabs. Actually, they spoke Arabic at the time, all of them, and the intelligentsia spoke Turkish. And how that society, the fabric of that society, is torn up because of new ideologies, in that case too, largely because of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and then the growth of Palestinian nationalism, and the imaginary that we have to separate one from the other. And that separation has to be done by all means. That is radical surgery. And when you think about the United States, which is, of course, a society, to its great credit, a society of so many groups, so many religions, people who've come from all over the world, how do you keep this balance together? If you introduce this rhetoric of white supremacy, of hatred of immigrants, of fear of those crossing the border, of different cultures coming into our peaceful little towns, then you can quite quickly turn that wonderful mosaic of different religions, different groups, different traditions into one of violence. And we have to keep that in mind constantly and to beware of that danger.
Yes, and I think Mohandas Gandhi actually observed at the time of the creation of the State of Israel, he felt that Jews should be able to live peacefully and safely anywhere in the world, but that creating a state that was supposed to be exclusively Jewish was going to create a whole new generation of problems, which I would have to say his observation has turned out to be true. And just to kind of go in a retrospective direction, it's generally considered by many, not necessarily the Catholic Church, but by many others, that the golden age of Spain was prior to the Inquisition, when there was an enormous intermixing of Moorish Muslims and Jews and Christians and even pagans all throughout the Iberian Peninsula. And there was an enormous explosion of trade, art, culture, music, and prosperity in terms of, food diversity and food resilience. And that was the era when everybody was living together without a sense that they didn't belong. And once that changed, once the Inquisition started and they were going to get all the non-Catholics out of there, they started on a downhill. I mean, they had enormous wealth they extracted from the New World, but aside from that, socially and internal economics, Spain declined, and so did Portugal. And so I think it's a great case study in what that really means. If we value prosperity and we value culture and community, then diversity seems to be one of the necessary ingredients of that. We're hearing more and more, really for the first time in years, for a U.S. administration to be talking vocally about a two-state solution in Israel. At this point, do you think a two-state solution is a viable approach?
Yeah, let me just say one thing, because it's so interesting that Gandhi, as you said, was worried about what would happen with the Jewish state that would be only for the Jews, and now the current leadership of India and the Modi is actually fighting very hard to make it into a strictly Hindu country, although they have 200 million Muslims there.
Right.
And that is breeding a lot of violence, a lot of fear, and so forth. So exactly this kind of ethno-nationalism, which has all the trappings of ethnic cleansing, of hatred, and of violence. And that is where we are right now in the case of Israel-Palestine. Is there a way out of this? Yes, I think there is, and I think there always was. I think we also have to believe that there is, and to draw plans for that, because if you accept this kind of grim logic that this is the way it's going to be, that this is going to be a struggle for yet another century, then you are basically already setting up the next conflict, the next bout of killing. I think there is. I think for now, the first thing that has to happen is obviously to end this cycle of violence, but it has to be done under sort of larger understanding. The political paradigm has to be changed. Now, for a long time, people spoke about a two-state solution. The traditional two-state solution, I think, is gone. It's impossible, because you have now over 500,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. The West Bank has been cut up into tiny islands. It's a kind of archipelago of Arab settlements cut up by roads and settlements. And so to think of two states that are entirely separate from each other, the populations are so mixed now that it would be very hard to do without, again, a huge amount of violence. And that would be also internal violence in each of these communities. But I think what can be done as a blueprint, and I've been involved with a group that talks about it, it's called Land for All, and your listeners can Google it up, is an attempt to create two states in confederation with each other. So there would be two states along the 67 borders, more or less. But the difference would be that there would be a distinction between citizenship and residence. So you could be a citizen of one state and a resident of another. And if you think about it, that's how the EU works, of course. I mean, you can be a Frenchman but live in Berlin, and you'd be voting for the French parliament, but you'd be allowed to live in Berlin. But you have to obey German laws, not French laws, if there are any differences between them. If you could create that, it would mean that, say, those settlers who would like to stay in the state of Palestine would be allowed to stay there. Then they would vote for the Israeli parliament, for the Knesset. But they would have to, of course, obey all the laws and regulations of the Palestinian state. And if they didn't, then they could be deported or jailed. The same Palestinians living in Nablus or living in Tucson, Arizona, as refugees or as, in exile, could go back to the Palestinian state, but could also go, say, and live in Haifa. But if they lived in Haifa, they would be residents, not citizens. They would vote for the Palestinian parliament. And the numbers would have to be controlled, of course, as they are also in Europe. You can't have 5 million Frenchmen moving to Germany. That would not work. So you'd have to control the numbers. And in terms of the fact that the country is now, the infrastructure is so inextricably linked in all these regions that separating these territories from each other entirely with wars and fences would be extremely difficult. So you would have a confederation that would then take care of this mutual infrastructure and would, of course, control also the external borders, foreign affairs of these two states, which would have their own capitals in Jerusalem, their own institutions in Jerusalem as a capital, and would have the two most important elements that both national movements want. One is self-determination, and the second is the right of return. If that were to be created, that would take a long time. It's not something that can happen tomorrow. It is possible that in the long run, these two entities would become more and more mixed with each other, and they could transform also into a binational state. But for now, I think that would be the direction in which you could go.
Very interesting. And confederations of states, we have different models of that all around the world. As you mentioned, the EU is a good example. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you to say anything else that you feel we may have left out in our conversation, but also give our listeners information about how they can find out more, both about your work and perhaps some of the news that we might otherwise be missing if we're not looking in the right places.
The first thing that I think is really important for your listeners and for American citizens is to understand, and this is sort of curious thing, right? Because the United States is a vast country. It's an entire continent. It's a hugely important power in the world. But many Americans don't really know much about what's happening outside of their vast country. So they have a great deal of influence, potential influence. Their politicians, their institutions do, but they are not always terribly well informed. So I think it behooves people listening to you, A, to inform themselves, and I can say something about that, and B, to actually try and have more impact on their government, on their representatives. I think, in fact, that the current administration has some generally the right idea as to what should be done, but it's not pushing this strongly enough, in part because I think there's not enough pressure on it to do so. I think if more Americans were actually involved in putting pressure on their own government, then things could move faster. This Samantha Power wrote about that many years ago in A Problem from Hell, in her book about events in the former Yugoslavia. In democracies, people have power, but they often don't use it. And the power is not only in the ballot box. The power is actually in civil action. And so I would encourage people to inform themselves and to protest against this government's policies. As to where to find information, well, about me and what I wrote, it's easy. You can just Google me and you'll find a lot. Or go to Brown University and you'll find what I wrote and various things that I've been writing more recently on the events. But more importantly, there are some, the American media is unfortunately not very informative on what's happening around the world, and certainly not in the Middle East. I would recommend two sources. To go to the website of the Haaretz newspaper in English. Haaretz is the only Israeli newspaper that provides a lot of critical inside information on Israel. It's not only liberal, but it's mostly liberal. And if you want to know much about what's happening in Israel itself, that's a very good source. If you want to know much more than you'll ever hear from American news associations about what's happening in Gaza, the best source that I know is Al Jazeera. And it's very easy to get Al Jazeera. You can get it on your phone, and you will get live reports from Gaza on a 24-hour basis. And you can really, if you use these two sources, which I use, you will get not a balanced view, but at least one that will inform you much more than you can from, CNN, MSNBC, or whatever is out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to underscore that Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza have been targeted repeatedly. A number of them have actually died in the war, along with over a score of other journalists who have been killed in action, as it were, in Gaza. And there's at least anecdotal evidence at this point that a number of those deaths were very, very targeted, deliberate attacks by the Israeli military. Well, Omer Bartov, it's been wonderful to have you on the show and to hear your insight. And I look forward to reading your book, which I have just ordered, The Holocaust in Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. And thank you again for being here on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you so much for having me.